Question of what is news is one of those questions we can't really answer. There's a number of factors that go into determining what constitutes news, what gets reported, what appears in newspapers, on radio, on TV, on the web. But it's helpful to have a general sense of what we feel is newsworthy. And if you Google what is news, you're going to come up with a number of different pages and handouts and items like that, and they're all helpful, and they all more or less say the same thing. Um, I'm going to share with you something called the 7 Pillars of Newsworthiness, which is something that we got from the Tap Into organization that we work with closely, and I think it's a pretty good summary of what constitutes news. And it's important for us as reporters, as journalists, even as editors, to have that sense, to know what our readers want, and more importantly, what our readers need, the information they need to have. So I'm just going to share the 7 pillar screen up here. And you should be able to see it now. Let me put it in the slideshow. Great. Okay. So there's 7 items here. And the first one is impact or consequences. You always want to be aware of how what you're covering affects your reader. That's what's most important. So if you cover a school budget, a municipal budget, a state budget, yes, you're going to report how large the budget is, but you want to think about how that affects your readers. How much are their taxes going to go up? What new programs are in that budget? What programs, existing programs, aren't there? A simple example I can give you, in our work with Tap Into Greater Olean, we get a lot of news releases from the city of Olean about road projects. And it's great, that they always tout, okay, we're doing this work on bridges, we're repaving this road. But usually at the bottom of the news release, it mentions that the road's going to be closed for a few hours or a few days. And to us, that's what readers need to know. So we take that news release and we rewrite it. Normally, that's kind of at the beginning of the news release so that people know that for the next week or so, they're going to have to plan another route. So just in general, as you write stories, as you cover events, think about what the impact is, because that's what readers need to know, and that's why it's newsworthy. Conflict is, I think, by human nature, we we're intrigued by conflict, and conflict also, goes back to that first pillar. And a lot of these, items overlap. If there's something that people are arguing about, if there's strong proponents on either side, usually it's something that when it gets decided is going to affect us. So, we like to follow conflict in a weird sort of way. It's entertaining. It's human nature. It appeals to us, and it makes news. There's, reporters want to report both sides of the stories, especially when people are passionate about an argument, about an issue. Loss of life, property destruction. It's the amount. It's just how severe a story is. If there's a car accident, car accidents unfortunately happen frequently. It's usually a short, police item. If somebody dies, more than one person dies, it becomes a bigger story. Same thing with property destruction. There's house fires, all the time. There's stories. Sometimes they're not even stories. If a few people die in that house fire, then it becomes a larger story. So it's the magnitude of the story that affects whether or not or how newsworthy it is. Proximity is something that makes items news. Always look for that local angle, whether it's a positive or a negative. As I'm recording this, the Summer Olympics are taking place. Do you have an athlete from your coverage area who's maybe involved in that? If there's a band doing a national tour, it's not news if they're playing like in other parts of the country. If that band comes to your town or your coverage area, then it becomes news. Okay, and proximity also is if something happens in your town, that's important. If there's somebody involved in a big national event, somebody gets a big honor, that makes it news for you, makes it news for your readers. Prominence. Some people, just by virtue of who they are, whatever happens to them is news. Look at the president. If the president's dog dies, which happened recently, just a few days before I recorded this, it's news. Most of us have had pets. We've gone through the experience of losing a pet. It's not news. It's something we deal with privately. Prominence also works 2 ways. If you have somebody gets a ticket for driving while intoxicated, again, it's a small item in the police blotter. If that person who gets the ticket happens to be the mayor or the superintendent of schools, or a prominent member of your community, an athlete, then it becomes news. So, you kind of have, the good side and the good parts and the bad side parts about, being a prominent person, being a public figure. Whatever you do is going to become news, as opposed to, someone who's not a prominent figure. Timeliness. Now more than ever, we live in a 24/7 news cycle. People want their news right away. If you're reporting something, a day or so later, or even a few hours later, it's not news anymore. People have already read that either in a competitor's, website, or maybe they're just reading it on Facebook from people who are, they're covering something themselves. So timeliness more important than ever. If you miss that story, then look for a follow-up angle, look for a second day lead, because sometimes you might not be there while the story's breaking, or somebody may beat you to the story. But if it's a big enough story, it's going to continue. The story is going to have what are known as legs, and there's going to be opportunities for additional stories. Novelty is kind of, to me, the best way to describe what news is. News is the unusual. It's a cliche. Dog bites a man, it's not a news. Man bites dog, it's news. Silly cliche, but that's really what it is. A lot of times, as a journalism professor, as someone who's a journalist, I hear people say, well, why don't you write about the good things people do? And my answer is, that's not news. If you get up in the morning, you go to work, you do your job the way it's supposed to be, that's what you're expected to do. If you do something unusual, if you embezzle money, not necessarily something bad. If you win a big award, then that becomes news. That's unusual. But just doing your job, going about your life the way you should be. I commend you for it. We all should do that. But from a journalism standpoint, it's not news. Before I go, I just want to touch on 3 other points which have a role in determining what is news, and those are analytics, feedback, and sources. I'll just go through them quickly. Today, more than ever, we have the ability to see what stories people are reading. We can actually see that in real time. And that does determine in some news organizations what gets covered. As a journalist, I'm not crazy about that, but the reality is that's how the business works today. So that I always tell my students that you have to keep in mind that with a few exceptions, news organizations exist to make a profit. So they're going to cover stories that people are going to read. So the more readers they get, the more clicks they get on the web, the more they can charge for advertising. Analytics, do determine to a certain extent what gets covered, what doesn't get covered. Feedback, works too. Not just feedback in the terms of data and analytics. If people respond to a story, sometimes you might do a story that generates controversy, that generates interest. Maybe you do a big investigation, and your story leads to legislation, or somebody consequences for somebody in their job. So you get feedback from your stories. You want to get feedback. You don't want to just write in a vacuum. You want to know that people are reading your stories, so that that also determines what becomes news. And finally, sources. And when people see sources, they generally think of documents or information being leaked, anonymous sources. And yes, that's part of that. But sources also are a more kind of organized, part of the communication systems. There's organizations, mostly large ones, but small ones too, that have very sophisticated, public relations operations. So they flood journalists with press releases, with press conferences, social media items. And not all of them are news, but a lot of what becomes news is generated from public relations people. And you're not going to take what they write and just plop it onto your website, but it'll give you an idea. It'll give you you're always looking for news, and oftentimes if someone is really good at public relations, they're going to know what those 7 pillars are, and they're going to pitch you stories that fit into those areas. So let me just close by reminding you of 2 things that this is great. Please kind of keep all this in mind, but also keep in mind that our industry is one that's ever changing. So there's been changes. What's newsworthy today may not have been newsworthy 10, 15 years ago. And that's, to me, that's what makes journalism challenging. That's what makes journalism fun. So, with that, just, sign off for now, and we'll be back again soon. Thanks for listening.